If you would, open up your Bibles to 1 Kings 17. I want to set this up a little bit before we jump in. If you've ever read some of the history of Israel in Kings, in Chronicles, there's even in Samuel, there's kind of this ongoing, repeated pattern of, man, like things are just dark. Israel is in a rough spot. Like very few people are pursuing the Lord. Lots of people are going after idols. And Israel's leadership, the priesthood and the kings, who are supposed to be leading Israel in righteousness, are in fact doing the opposite. They are leading the people of God into deeper and deeper levels of sin. Now, when I read stuff like that in the Bible, I find it encouraging. I know. I find it encouraging because I look around this city that we live in. I look around the nation that we're living in. And you see, when I come to the Word, and I see that even in the darkest moments, God is there. And God is working. And the corrupt priests and the corrupt kings and the people of God who have turned away from Him, they don't get the final say over the story. That God alone gets to write the final chapter. And I want to tell someone today that maybe as you look out on the state of this nation, on the state of this city, on the state of the church in America, I can tell you some really, really good news, and it's that God is still seated on the throne. And He's still moving and He's still working. G.K. Chesterton, this old-time Catholic guy, he said this about how the faith always comes back. He said, at least 5 times, 5 moments in history, the faith has to all appearances gone to the dogs. But in each of the 5 cases, it was the dog that died. That's kind of hilarious and really good all at the same time. Then he goes on to say this: Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it has a God who knows His way out of the grave. That's got to be, you guys have heard me quote that at least 84 times. You know it's going to be a good sermon when I open up with G.K. Chesterton. 1 Kings 17:1 says this: Now Elijah the Tishbite from the Gilead settlers said to Ahab, Ahab is the king of Israel, as Yahweh, God of Israel lives, in whose presence I stand, there will be no dew or rain during these years, except by my command. Now what's happening here? Ahab and his wife Jezebel have introduced to the people of God the idol of Baal. And this false religion has infiltrated not just a few parts, a few places, a few pieces of Israel, but in the highest level of leadership, there's corruption, there's brokenness, there's dysfunction. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Right? Come on, somebody. There's a brokenness, there's a dysfunction, there's a disorder. But here's the thing that most people don't know. I was researching this. Baal, in ancient Canaanite religion, was the god of rain and fertility and storms. It was a fertility cult. And it was this understanding that the rain comes down and the earth produces. And so it's this idea that Baal is the god of wind and storms and rain who gives life to the earth. And so what Elijah does by calling for a drought, and let's just say I wish I had that level of faith and my prayers did that much. My man calls a drought and it didn't rain for 3 years. And the purpose of the drought is to expose to Israel's leadership that Baal is not the God of rain, that Baal is bankrupt of any kind of authority. And you see, sometimes there's these drought moments in life and in the world. And if you're not looking at it right, you'll feel like, man, we're just hurting for some water. But I think sometimes the drought is actually the gift of God, because He's exposing the bankruptcy of our idols. And sometimes in life, we lean on things that are not God for meaning, for value, for purpose, for happiness. Maybe it's success. Maybe it's career. Maybe it's your party being in office. Maybe it's money in the bank, whatever it is. And when God takes those things away, maybe He's exposing the idols that we've been clinging on to. Elijah says here, as Yahweh God of Israel lives, in whose presence I stand, there will be no dew or rain. You see, what does God do when Israel's priesthood is corrupted, when Israel's kingship is corrupted? What God does as a response to a corrupt kingship and a corrupt priesthood is to raise up a prophet named Elijah. The prophets are the response to the corrupt leadership in the nation, the corrupt leadership in the spiritual realm. And I believe we're in a moment right here. If I can speak prophetically to you, church, I believe we're in one of these moments where God is raising up some Elijahs. God's raising up some prophets. He's raising up some people. And they might not have the official authority when it comes to the channels of systems of what the world values. But there's some men and women who, like Elijah, can say, I stand in the presence of God, and I've seen the face of God in prayer. And it's out of that place that God raises up some Elijahs who aren't going to bow the knee to Baal like everybody else does. And I believe we're in this moment where God's raising up some Elijahs. And what we're going to get to in a minute is Elijah's going to call down fire from heaven. And it says that at the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah set up the altar and the fire fell. And the funny thing about that is, Elijah's not a priest. He's not allowed to make sacrifices. He's not a Levite. But you see, when the leadership, when the spiritual leadership is corrupted, God will raise up an Elijah. And I believe right now you can look out and say, the church in America is corrupt. Pastors are going crazy. They're falling into sin. They're taking money. They're sleeping around. Churches are closing their doors. But what Elijah's about to find out is that he's not alone, and that Yahweh has 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal. And I believe there's 7,000 in this city that haven't bowed the knee to Baal. And He's looking for some Elijahs who will say, I stand in His presence. I'm looking for some people who will say, listen, hear me from the bottom of my heart, church. I am not a perfect man. I am not a perfect husband. I'm not a perfect father. I'm not a perfect pastor. But I can tell you, I stand in His presence. I've seen His face in prayer. I've stood before His throne. And I said, God, here I am. God, here I am. Would you do something in this city? Would you do something in this nation? That's what the prophets are. It's someone that God raises up and who says, I've seen His face. I know His voice. And hear me, church, we can get good at a lot of things. I hope our building looks nicer. Please, it needs it. Donate generously. But listen, I am not interested in showing up to a nice building with nice people, just having a nice cozy time when the world around us is broken. First Kings 18 verse 20. So Ahab, this is the king, summoned all the Israelites and gathered the prophets at Mount Carmel. And Elijah approached all the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow Him. But if Baal, follow him. but the people didn't answer him a word. Here's what you have to see here. The prophets of Baal, they were not anti-Yahweh. They didn't mind people worshiping Yahweh. What they minded was, don't tell me Yahweh's the only God I can worship. Oh, we don't mind, Elijah, if you want to worship Yahweh, but don't stand here and tell me that I have to worship Yahweh. You see, there's nothing new under the sun. In the moment we're in today, people literally do not care if you're a Christian. People don't care. Hey, that's your truth. Live your truth. But don't tell me he's the only way. Don't tell me he's the only truth. Don't tell me he's the only life. And yet what the Elijahs do is they force a decision. They force a choice. If Baal is God, follow him. If Yahweh is God, follow him. That there cannot be a coexistence. Listen, there is one God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God revealed in Jesus of Nazareth. And let me tell you, he doesn't share well. Oh, don't get me wrong, he's generous. He gave everything away, even his own life. But he will not enter into a partnership with our idols. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. I read this a couple weeks ago. Josh quoted it earlier, and Jesus said it was the greatest commandment. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. One. Love Yahweh your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength. These words that I'm giving you today are to be in your heart. Repeat them to your children. Come on, parents. Talk about them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind these words as a sign on your hand. Let them be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your city gates. Everywhere you go, everything you do, let it be that Yahweh our God is one. And we love him with all our hearts, all our minds, all our strengths. That's all that matters at the end of the day. And sometimes we have this mindset like, well, God is first, and then I have these other things. Listen, he doesn't want to be first. He wants to be the only one. Listen, Israel, he doesn't want to be number one while Baal can be number two. He's not having it. If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. And listen, for every area of your life, it's not like, well, God is number one, and then your marriage is number two, your family's number three, your work's number four. No, listen, Yahweh alone is God. And your family, your work, your money, your time are all gifts from him that he asks you to steward well. It's all him. My marriage is not separate from my relationship with the Lord. The way I love my wife is a picture of how I love Jesus. The way I parent my kids is a picture of how I love Jesus. The way I steward my money is a picture of how I love Jesus. And so it's not Yahweh's over here, number one, but then I have these other things. It's all his presence. It's all his grace. It's all submitted to his leadership and to his lordship. And I'm calling you today to a radical sacrifice. I am calling you today to give up every idol. And sometimes, listen, idols are good things that we raise up to a place that they don't deserve in our lives. He forces a choice. Verse 22. Elijah said to the people, I am the only remaining prophet of Yahweh, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us. They are to choose 1 bull for themselves, cut it in pieces, and place it on the wood, but not light the fire. I will prepare the other bull and place it on the wood, but not light the fire. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of Yahweh. And the God who answers with fire, he is God. All the people answered, that's fine. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, since you are so numerous, choose for yourselves 1 bull Prepare it first. Call in the name of your God, but don't light the fire. So they took the bull that he gave them, prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, Baal, answer us. But there was no sound, no one answered. Then they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah mocked them, and he said, shout loudly, for he's a god. Maybe he's thinking it over. Elijah just making fun of him now. Maybe he's wandered away. Maybe he's on the road. Perhaps he's sleeping and will wake up. They shouted loudly and cut themselves with knives and spears, according to their custom, until blood gushed over them. All afternoon they kept on raving until the offering of the evening sacrifice, but there was no sound. No one answered. No one paid attention. You see, church, the idols always make empty promises. The idols that we set up, they offer us happiness, value, feeling like my life counts, that I can be at peace, that I can be happy. And yet what we see here is how empty our idols really are. No one heard. No one paid attention. There wasn't even a sound. See, the prophets of Israel, they used to mock the surrounding nations, saying, your idols, they have eyes, but they don't see. They have ears, but they don't hear. They have feet, but they can't walk. And the funny thing is, those are the very words that Jesus uses to describe us in sin. That we become like what we worship. Did you know that? We become like our idols, with eyes, but we can't see what God's doing. With ears, but we can't hear what God is saying. And you see them, they're getting more and more desperate that maybe if they shed their blood for Baal, Baal would hear them. And you see the beauty of the Christian gospel is that it's not my blood. It's not my blood that makes him answer me. That the beauty of the gospel is that my God shed his blood for me. That he put himself on the cross for me. That he put himself on the altar for me. Verse 30. Elijah said to all the people, come near me. So all the people approached him. Then he repaired Yahweh's altar that had been torn down. So Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of Yahweh had come, saying, Israel will be your name. And he built an altar with the stones in the name of Yahweh. Then he made a trench around the altar, large enough to hold about 4 gallons. Next he arranged the wood, cut up the bull, and placed it on the wood. And he said, fill 4 water pots with water and pour it on the offering to be burned on the wood. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to know. If you want something to burn, you don't put water on it. Then he said a second time, and they did it a second time. Then he said a third time, and they did it a third time. So the water ran all around the altar, and it even filled the trench with water. Okay, so fire's about to fall. We'll get to that in a minute. Before we do, I want you to see what happens before the fire comes. Before the fire of God comes down, Elijah has to rebuild the altar. Fire is not going to fall on nothing. The fire of God, the presence, the glory, the majesty, the outpouring of the Spirit is not going to fall on nothing. Where does it fall? On the altar. You see, you don't get a move of God because you wake up one day and fire fell out of nowhere. It starts with some Elijahs who are going to rebuild the altar piece by piece, block by block, brick by brick. We're going to rebuild the altar. What is the altar? The altar is the place of sacrifice. The altar is the place of encounter. And for the men, Nate's going to say a whole lot more about that at the men's group next week, not this week. You got to come and hear it. The altar is the place of sacrifice and encounter. It's the place where you and I set ourselves to sacrifice the bull, to lay out the pieces, to arrange the altar, and to meet with God. And until there's a group of Elijahs who are going to begin to rebuild the altar in their own private lives, in their families, in their churches, until that happens, we're not going to see the fire come. But if you and I will humble ourselves and begin to rebuild the secret place, the place of prayer, the place of fasting, the place of worship, the place of seeking the face of God, like Elijah said, in whose presence I stand. If you and I will rebuild that altar, we will see the fire of God poured out on our lives. We'll see the fire of God poured out on a city. And listen, I'm telling you, man, I don't care if it's like Elijah. I don't care if it's me and Kelly and 3 of us. I'm rebuilding the altar. I don't care if there's 100 prophets of Baal staring me in the eyes. I'm rebuilding this altar brick by brick. I'm going to pray. I'm going to fast. I'm going to be in the Word. And we're going to see the fire of God poured out on a city, poured out on this region. I see it by the Spirit. I see it now. And I feel the Lord calling you today. I'm saying, come on, let's rebuild the altar. Let's rebuild that altar. It says he rebuilt it in the name of Yahweh. Now, I got some stuff about the name that I don't have time for. But the name of God is a powerful thing. You know, in the book of Revelation, everybody knows about the mark of the beast. Did you know the Revelation gives you another mark? It's called the mark of the Lamb. Did you know that? It says that the name of the Lamb will be on their foreheads. You see, at the end of the day, church, it's really only about 2 names. There's no in the middle. There's no trying to hold both together. There's no little bit of this, little bit of that. You are either marked by the beast and the world's ways, or you're marked by the name of Yahweh and the Lamb who's seated on the throne. Which name will we go by? Which name will we be called by? Verse 36, at the time for offering the evening sacrifice, the prophet Elijah approached the altar and said, Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that at your word I have done all these things. Answer me, Yahweh, answer me, so that this people will know that you, Yahweh, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Then Yahweh's fire fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell face down and said, Yahweh, He is God. Yahweh, He is God. I love the fire of God, the fire of the Holy Spirit, the very presence and glory of God. It didn't just stay with the sacrifice. It took all the wood, it took the altar, and it even took the water that was in the trench. What is the fire of God here? We know from Scripture, the fire is the very presence of God, a physical manifestation of God before their eyes. We know that when the Israelites left Egypt, it was a pillar of cloud and fire that led them out of Egypt. We know that He appeared to Abraham as a fire pot. We see this throughout the Word, that the fire is the very presence of God. And you see, when the presence of God comes, if you've built the altar, the fire of God doesn't just stay in one little corner. It consumes everything. It consumes everything that gets in the way. And I'm at a point in my life right now when I'm like, Lord, take all of me. If there's any part of you that hasn't yet burned up some stuff in me, send the fire. Hebrews says, our God is a consuming fire. And my prayer lately is, God, burn away, torch anything in me that's not of you. I don't want it anymore. Now maybe you hear this and you say, Joey, well, that's nice for Israel. That's nice for Elijah. Maybe people would get saved if we called down fire from heaven today. I don't know. Still working on getting to Elijah status, to be honest with you. But here's what I do know. You and I, living on this side of the cross, actually have something better than what Elijah had. Where has the fire of God's glory fallen after the cross? The day of Pentecost. And the funny thing about the day of Pentecost is, it says that there was 120 praying in the upper room. Hello, altar. And it says that there appeared in the room, there was a sound of wind, and then there appeared tongues like fire that separated and rested on each one. Here's what that means. What is the sign that Yahweh is God to Youngstown, Ohio in 2025? To Newcastle, Pennsylvania, to Columbiana, to Warren? What is the sign? Where's the fire? Where's the glory? Where's the presence? It's not in a building or a program. It's not in a system or an agenda. It's you. You are the sign to a broken world that Yahweh is God. And if the world has looked at the church and said that Yahweh's not God, that's on us. Now listen, I can't control what every person thinks. I can't control what every person does. There's always going to be people that do what they want. But if by and large the culture has looked at the American church and not seen fire, that's on us. And I believe right now God's getting ready to pour out some fire again. A.W. Tozer, listen, it wouldn't be complete without Tozer. He said this: current evangelicalism has set up the altar and the sacrifice, but now seems content, satisfied, to count the stones and rearrange the pieces without caring that we have no fire. But God be thanked, there are a few who care. Anybody want to be the few? There are those who love the altar and delight in the sacrifice, but cannot reconcile themselves to the continued absence of fire. They desire God above all. And man, that hit me right in the heart when I was reading it. That there are those who they love the altar, they love the sacrifice, but there's those who cannot reconcile themselves to the continued absence of fire. Cannot reconcile themselves to a lack of the presence of God. And I'm telling you, if God's not going to show up when we meet, I'd rather shut it down. And I'm the lead pastor. I'm not interested. But man, if the fire of God comes, you'll find me right here on these steps. You'll find me right here before His presence. And I believe that God's looking for a few who will get this thing in their heart and they cannot reconcile themselves to the continued absence of fire. Why? It's the sign. It's the sign to the city that He's God. And listen, nice, comfortable church will not save this city, but the fire of God will. Nice, comfortable church will not keep your kids from turning their back on God when they turn 18, but the fire of God will. Nice, comfortable church won't heal the sick and cast out demons, but the fire of God will. And I'm looking for somebody this morning who will not reconcile themselves to the continued absence of fire.